So come to the previous one topic. Just look at here. I hope this is visible. That is the servlet context. We have seen two things. One is your servlet config and second one is servlet context. Servlet context is initialized. Just look at this statement. Within a web application, all of the servlets are shared the same environment, and servlet container exposes the environment to the servlet context. And when the servlet context get initialized, it get initialized at the time that web application loaded. Okay, so in our web application, there will be only one object of servlet context. Okay, there will be only one object of servlet context. So suppose you have only one object. Okay, so to explain this, let's come to this. Here you can see that this is one servlet, this one, and this one is another servlet, that is home, and student home is another servlet. So we can say that in our application there are three servlets. Okay, and all will be the part of your application. All will be the part of your application. Servlet, user verify servlet, home servlet, student servlet, and index.jsp. So all the things are the part of your application. Fine. So there will be one object. There will be one object in your container of type servlet context. This is your servlet context. You don't need to create it. Tomcat will create and it will provide that object, and it will be shared by all servlets. It means it can be accessed by this. Okay, and this servlet is also accessible by this servlet. Okay, and this servlet context is also accessible by the third one. The context object is a single object. So for per application, there is only one servlet context. And if you put anything into the servlet context, you can access on any servlet. Clear? So there will be only one servlet context object. Why I'm telling you this? Because this may ask in your interview that how many objects will be created of the servlet context. So per application, only one servlet context. How many servlet config is available? So per servlet class, there will be servlet configuration object. Okay, so we have already seen that how to access the values into this from the servlet context. So this is the thing that you should remember, that servlet context is only one in your application. One more thing that we have seen is response, redirecting the response. This last point, remember, you cannot call the send redirect after the response is committed and after out is flushed. Just remember this point and just note down this point. When I'll write some code, then I'll explain that what is the meaning of this point. Okay. Now come to this part. This is very important. Okay. Invoking the other web resources. How to invoke other web resources when you send a request to a particular resource. What is mean by this heading is, just look at here. Suppose you are at client side and you send a request to a servlet. Okay, and this servlet will invoke another. You are not calling that resource. Understand this point. You are not calling that resource for invocation. This servlet is calling that resource for invocation. Okay, so we can say that this will be the communication within the server. Within the server, this communication will not be between client and server. Okay, look at this. This is your client and this is your server, and in server you can have as many as number of servlets as per your requirement. This is fine. User will send a request for a particular resource, that is your servlet. Now this servlet that we have already designed here, this one, this servlet wants to invoke this servlet, and after that response will go back to the client. Not direct response will go back from here to the client. So in that case, you can see here, this client will send a request. It means the client and server communication. But if this resource invokes internally any resource that is available into the server, then we can say that it is inter-server communication. Within the server, this communication is happening. So if we want to invoke some resources within the server, then we use Requestdispatcher. We use Requestdispatcher. Look at here. So a Requestdispatcher happens on the server while a redirect happens on the client. A Requestdispatcher hands the request to another component on the server, usually within the same web app. Okay, so this Requestdispatcher we use for inter-server communication, inter-thread communication, we can say. Okay, because every servlet, whenever any request comes, then every servlet's thread will be created. So that thread will communicate with another resource within the application. So if this is servlet, then it will also have another thread. So this thread will communicate with another thread within the server. So for that, we use Requestdispatcher. And to invoke any resource, then we use methods like forward and include. There are two methods which is available to invoke the internal resources. One is called the forward and second one is called the include. So you can use any one of them, but it depends that when should we use the forward and when should we use the include. So it depends upon our requirement. I'll explain both of method, and whenever you required and you come across the situation that this thing is happening in your application, so according to your need, you can use the forward and the include. So what is the meaning of forward? Just look at here. When you forward any request, okay, Requestdispatcher, then two things will be passed. One is your servlet request object request, and another one is your servlet response object of the response. This method allows a servlet to process a request partially and then forward the request to the another servlet for generating the final response. This method can be called only if the response is not committed, otherwise it will throw an illegal state exception. Means if you say that response.send redirect, so response will go back to the user, and after that if you write that um, forward, then since your response has been committed and you are invoking the inter-thread communication, so it is an illegal state exception, and this type of the exception comes into the inter-thread communication, that is illegal state exception. So how to invoke another resource? Just come to this part here. So response.send redirect, we are sending a response back to the home. In place of response.send redirect, I'm going to use request dispatcher. Okay. So I'll comment it and I'll explain that what is difference between response.send redirect and request dispatcher. So if your user is admin and user is verified, then send that user to the home page. And after that, response will go back to the client. Now I'm going to create the object of request dispatcher here. Request dispatcher RD is equal request dot get request dispatcher. And where you want to go, so I want to communicate with the home servlet. Fine. And after that, when you create the object of request dispatcher, you need to do one thing, either forward or include. So I'm going to use the forward one here. So rd dot forward, and two objects you need to pass into the forward. One is your servlet request object, and another one is your servlet response object. And the same object you need to pass, which is created by the invocation of the user, the client. And we can say that these are two objects which has been created on the user's request. That is the request object. So you need to pass this request object to another resource. Then that will be a proper communication. If you put something into it, then you can access this value to other resource. So rd.forward, then it will go into the home page. So this is the way that you can do this. So before invocation of this code, let me comment it. And first, just look at the response.send redirect one more time. Just look at here. This is the admin, and this is the password. I think the username is wrong. Password. Now you can see that user has been verified, and since the user is admin, we are at home page. And one more thing you need to see here, that URL, look at here. URL says that you are at home page. Got it? Now, I'm not using the response.send redirect. I'm going to use forward. Request dispatcher, dispatch to the home page, that is rd.forward, request and response. Again, I'm going to write, okay? So now look at the output. We are at home page, fine. But what is the URL? The URL says you are at user verify servlet, but the response is coming from the home servlet. Getting? Why this happened? Because when you send a request for this servlet internally invoke this servlet, and then response go back to the user. So this communicate with this servlet, perform the operation, and send the response. So internally this communication happen, but Yes, servlet request and servlet response. Okay, so this happen internally into the servlet. So that's why your URL will not get changed, because you send a request for user verify servlet, but user verify servlet invokes another resource into your server, and after that it will send a response to the user. Okay. Yes, HTTP servlet request is not the same of the servlet request. Servlet request is the parent of HTTP servlet request. As servlet is the parent of HTTP servlet, so same servlet request is the parent of HTTP servlet request. Here, HTTP servlet, the parent of this servlet is servlet. Fine. So same as the servlet request parent is, sorry, HTTP servlet request parent is servlet request. So we can pass any child's object into the parent reference. We have already seen this, that is parent reference is equal new child's object. Have you remember that is upcasting? Okay, so that's why. So now I hope this is now clear. One more thing, that at the home page, this is your home page, I want to print welcome and the username, or I want to print the name of the user that is um, that gets login. So what will I do? I will write this. First, I will write welcome. Let me copy this. Copy and paste. Welcome, this one, and come to the user verified. Just look at it. This user has been verified. So what is the name of the user? So we can put the name of the user into the request object. Here, we are now setting the value into the request object that will be forward to another resource into your server, because it wants to communicate with the home, and we want to send the name of the user to this home servlet. Okay, so first we'll set the name, because this user verify servlet is not a form where you will put the value and you can send a request for the home servlet, because it is inter-thread communication, inter-server communication. So forward the value of any servlet to internally another servlet. We set the value by code, and here you will write two things, first and second. You will pass two value into the set attribute before the dispatching. First one is called the name of your attribute. Okay, and second one is called the corresponding value of the attribute. So the name you can write accordingly your requirement. It's up to the user, the developer, the coder, that what is the name attribute wants to set into the request object. So I will set the object as user. Okay, and the name, and we can say that the name we have already get from the user, that is username. So I want to set the username as, or you can get the value from the database also. So here is the username or user ID. So whatever the value you want to set. Now When this request will forward to the home page, it will carry this attribute and the value of the username. Now, the task is we want to get the name of this user onto the home page. Fine. So to get, since we have already set the value, so to get the value that you have set into the request object by the code, then you will write request dot get attribute. There you will use set attribute, and here you will use get attribute. And what is the attribute name? So I have the attribute name as user. So we'll get this value by using this attribute. So I'm writing request dot get attribute user, and we since we are writing the code, so we know that which type of the value we have stored into it. So I have stored the string type of the value, so I can take into the string. Fine. But this request, when you pass any value, actually it holds the value as object. And as we know that the object is the parent of all classes, so we can downcast accordingly that no, this is not the object, this is actually the string type of the object. So every time whenever you set any value, so you have to remember that which type of the object you have set into your request object, and accordingly you will downcast it. Now print the value here, s. If I reload this, now you can see that if I reload, then verification is done, welcome admin, because the username is admin. So we are getting the value from the request object into the home servlet, and here we are printing this value. So if you want to set the value, then first you will write request.set attribute, then where you want to get the value, then you will write the request.get attribute. And remember one more point, which type of the object you have put into the request object, you have to remember, and accordingly you will downcast. If you are putting a value that is the type of integer, so you will write here integer. If you set the value that is array list, then you will typecast into the array list. So in this example, I'm setting the value as a string, so that's why I'm downcasting into the string object. So then you can say that, sir, we can do the same operation by using the response.send redirect. Okay, so look at here. Response.send redirect, I am just commenting this point, and I will do the response.send redirect after setting the value. So first it will set into the request, and then it will go back to the response at home page. Now look at that we are getting the same value or not. So no, we are not getting the value, we are getting the null. So if you want to share the data between two resources into the server, okay, because you want to send the value from this to this servlet that is within the server, and for that we will not use the response, we will use the Requestdispatcher. And when you use the response.send redirect, then whatever the value you have set into the request object, it will be leave at the same servlet. It will not carry by the response. Now here. So void forward, that is, this method allows a servlet to process a request partially and then forward the request to the another servlet for generating the final response. This method can be called only if the response is not committed. Okay, if this is committed, then you will get error. What is the meaning of include? There is one more method. So what is meaning by the include? Void include the same parameter. This method allow the content of another resource to be included within the response being generated by the calling resource. So include means when you forward any resource from here by using this code. Let's look at here. Then what happened? Your request will be forwarded to the home page, and after that it will generate one output and it will go back as a response to the client. When you use the attribute include, we can use the include also, then the response of this page will be included into this page, and then the response will go back to the client. Just look at it. This method allows the content of another resource to be included with the response being generated by the calling resource. Unlike forwarding, control is not permanently passed to another resource. The include resource cannot set the headers of the status code of the response. Attempt to do so are ignored. So definitely response dot set header is there, request dot set header is not there. So this point you cannot use that to set the headers of any response by using the include and forward. This is only for the inter-thread communication, not for the response. Response is generated after the communication and it will go back to the user. So let me show you that what is mean by the include and the forward. Here I'm writing out dot print and something on this servlet. Just look at here. This is something on this servlet. And on which servlet? This is on user verify servlet. I'm using the include. Now look at the output. Okay, this is on the servlet. Admin, then password is, so now look at this. Something on the servlet of the page as well as the next resource output is also coming into the output. I hope it is clear. If you do the include, then the response being going for the request, then that output will be included into the same page, and after that it will go back as a response to the client. So this is the way that you can send a request dispatcher. You can use the request dispatcher by using include and by using forward. So there are so many things that you can do into the application. One is, suppose your page is HTML, so you cannot do the dynamic process. Means you cannot show the dynamic content on the HTML because it is designed for the static content. And this is the page. Suppose this is your HTML page, and you are writing and you are designing a page which asks the user for the username and the password, but that user is not verified. So you are not able to show here the dynamic content, that is username or password is incorrect. Got it? Why? Because if this is HTML page, I'm not saying that this is JSP. Okay, maybe it will create some. So let me create one page, HTML, and it is my index page. index.html. Let me copy and paste. Copy and paste. Close. Save. Let me run first. Now look at here. This is the HTML page. Now you can see. So you cannot set the dynamic content onto this page because it is static. So one thing we can do is I will not use the response.send redirect. I can use Requestdispatcher if user is not verified to the index.html, and then what I'm writing, include the output of this page. So what I'm going to write the output, out.println. Okay, here I will write into the center. This is one way. I'm not saying that this is only the way. This is one way. Okay, and into the center I will write the font color is equal red, and I will close the font, and here I will say username or password incorrect. So let's see if username and password is incorrect, then what happened? You can say that the username and password is incorrect, and we are including the page. So you can show the users appropriate messages according to this. So you can include pages, number of pages into one page by using the include like this. But with the response, this is not possible because the response will not include the data that is processed into this servlet. The output is not included into it. Yes, tell me, is it clear that Requestdispatcher using include and forward? Okay, good. So few things more. So retrieving the include page and forward page, this is the way that we can get the Requestdispatcher. So I'm not going to explain one more time this because we have already seen the example. Now come to this part. This is very important. And in application, the main theme is of every application is sharing the data with another resources and another component. So how to share the data in web application? To share a data, there are three levels we can say, or we can say that there are three scopes are defined in which you can put the data, and that data could be accessible. Fine. So how to share the data into the web application? So a web application consists one or more web components. One servlet puts the data in a well-known place which acts as a container, and other servlet access the data from that place. So if this servlet, just look at here, if this servlet wants to put some data, so it can put into some container, and from here, from that container, every servlet can access that data. Every servlet. So is it not necessary that the data that is putting by this servlet is accessible by this servlet. So this depends upon our coding technique and the requirement that where we want to and for which resource we want to share the data. So accordingly, we will put that data into that container. So if we want to share the data between two components only, okay, between two components only, or you can say the request is dispatching from the servlet and to the servlet, we want to share only between those two servlets, then we'll put that value into the request object, the servlet request object. And another container for sharing the data is HTTP session object. We'll see that what is HTTP session. And third one is called the servlet context. All three objects provide a method that is called set attribute. We have already seen that how to set the value into the object and how to get the value from the object. Or you can use the get attribute names and it will return the enumeration. So it will return the strings enumeration and then you can get the values by using those names. So we can say that the data sharing container, if we are using servlet request, then it will be available only between the sender and the receiver. Just look at here. This is the request.set attribute, and where it is going at home servlet. So this data that you are setting over here, it will be available between user verify servlet and home servlet. You cannot access this value into another servlet. Why? Because we are setting the value into the request. Okay, so if you set any value into the request servlet request object, then that will be available between the request from where you are dispatching and to the dispatched resource. Object sharing using servlet request are accessible only for the life of the request. So if the request is going to another resource, then that you can access. Objects shared using the HTTP session are accessible only for the life of the session. Yes, a student home cannot access it because you are not sending the request to the student servlet. Again, you can do one thing for your question bank. I'm just writing this. Look at here. This is the user verify servlet. I'm setting the value into the request, and this request is dispatching to the home. So definitely we can access the value at the home. Fine. But from here, I can do one more thing. Request. Come on. Request dispatcher. RD is equal request dot get request dispatcher. I'm just explaining it is not the scenario. Okay. A student servlet. Okay. And after that, RD dot forward. So what happened in this case? In this case, when this code will execute and it is forward to the home, then again I am doing this, that I am sending the request dispatcher to the student servlet and it will be forward to this place. So after that it will go into the student home. Okay, so internally we are communicating between two servlets, home servlet and student servlet. So now we can access the value that we have set it here. We can access onto the home servlet, because the life of the request is from here to home servlet to the student servlet. Getting my point? So until your request is not dead, then till you can access the value that you have set into the request object. And when your response will go back to the client, then request object will be destroyed. Request object will be destroyed. Now, so I will not do this because it will create some. Now, object sharing using HTTP sessions are available and accessible only the life of the session is available, and object sharing using servlet context are accessible for the life of web application. So earlier I told you that per application we have only one servlet context. So if you set any value into the servlet context, you can access that value onto any servlet. Got it? Now, one way is to set the value into the servlet context is by using web.xml, isn't it? We have seen yesterday. Have you remember that we can set the value into the servlet context by using the tag context param? Okay. If you want to set the value into the context dynamically at the coding time, then you can do the thing that you can set that value into the servlet context by getting the object of the servlet context and by using the method set attribute, and you can get the value by using the method get attribute. So I'm going to tell you that how to set the value into the servlet context through the code, not through the XML file that we have already discussed yesterday. So here, just come. This is the user verify. I'm going to set the value here. Okay. So first we'll get the servlet context object. I will not write here. I can, okay. Servlet context object is equal request dot get servlet context. And you can do this sc dot. I think I have already created that. Okay, here we have created that one. So that's why it is. So if we have, then I'm not going to create. Just look at here. Servlet context is already created. Now I'm going to set the value. sc dot set attribute. The attribute, you can put the name as per your requirement, as per your choice. This is the variable name, that is the attribute name. So XYZ. And here I'm writing a value into the servlet context. Now tell me where this value will be set. This value will be available. This value will be available for whole servlets which are available in your application. So it means this value can be accessed by any servlet, So to get the value that you have set into the context, for example, onto the home page, what I need to do is I will first get the servlet context object, servlet context sc. You can write any name. Request dot get servlet context. What is the attribute that I have set? So sc dot get attribute, an attribute name, I guess XYZ. Let me check. This is XYZ. Okay, so I can write XYZ. So I will get the value. Since I know that the value is the type of a string, so I can write this one. And again, need to typecast because it returns the object. So to check that the value is set into the context or not, you can simply print that value. Just come to the execution. Username is admin, password I'm going to write this one. Now you can say welcome to a value into the servlet context, and even this value can be also accessible onto the student servlet. Clear that how to set the value into the servlet by using the code? You can set the value by the set attribute. You can get the value by using get attribute. So this is one one container for sharing the data. Request is another container to sharing the data. Only the thing, the difference between these containers are the scope of your data. If you set the value into the request, then it will be limited to the request object. If you set the value into the context, it is available for all resources, all servlets, which are the part of your application, because per application, there is only one servlet context. Now, third one is your session. Third one is your session. So how to share the data by using the session? Where is this one? Okay, get versus post we have already discussed, so I'm not going to explain one again. Do get, do post. No. Not required. Since we have already seen these things, that's why I'm skipping this values, these slides. Method is get post, we have already seen. Okay. Not required. Not required. This. Okay, now this one is important. The second part of this application is called the session management. And one container I left, that is session. So two container we have already discussed, that is request and servlet context. So we'll see that what is session, but just wait for a moment. What is session management, and what is the use of this session management? So application, suppose you have one application, okay, in which, and that application is your shopping cart or any insurance quotation and a multi-page survey of the pages. So what you need to do with your application is, if user move from one resource to another resource or one page to another page, then definitely you want that this user information should be available onto another page. Okay, so you need to maintain the username or the user state on every page. So for that, what we do, we put the value of that user into the session, and per client, just remember this point, per client there is one session available. per client, there is one session available. And we maintain that session to maintain the integrity. How to maintain it? When you do the shopping, okay, so you can add the product in your cart as per your requirement. And suppose you are at one page where you can select the clothes, you are going into the another page that asks for another product like shoes or watch, so you can choose any one of the product. So when you choose any product, then it should be added to the same user's cart, not to the other user's cart, or not to the new user's cart. It should be available for the same user. So how to maintain this, that the value, the product that you are using is available for the same user? So we maintain that by using the session. Means we manage the session of the user. Okay, session means the request and response process till the client wants to communicate with your server. So there are so many ways to maintain this session. Generally, there are 4 ways to maintain it, to manage the session. And how to maintain by using 4 types, we'll see with the example. But come here. Since we know that the HTTP protocol is a stateless protocol, it is not stateful. Okay. So to make the HTTP as stateful, we use the session management technique. HTTP itself is not stateful, we know that. Application level statement management is needed. Means we need to make this HTTP request as stateful. Stateful means, just come here. This is your browser, okay? Means this is your client. So when you send a request from this browser, or when you send a request from this client to the server, then the request will go in the form of HTTP. And every time, whenever users send a request, whenever a client send a request, every time the container will create a new request object. Every time it will create a new user request. To explain this, that every time it creates a new request object, this is the student home servlet. Just look at here. And here you can see that there is a request object. Okay. What I'm going to write here, out.print and request.get parameter. I will pass one parameter with the name of name. So it will print the name of that parameter. Just run this file. This is your student home. So I'm going to pass one parameter with the name and is equal this one. So now you can see this, that when I'm sending a request to the servlet with the parameter name, it carries the value that is Daniel. Or what is the value? Whatever the value you want, you can pass to the parameter. So whenever I send a request, okay, so every time this object will be created, means we can say in one line that for per request from the client, it will be created. And according to the request, it will get the value from request object. So look at here. If we don't pass any value, then it will again go to the student servlet and again it will create a new serve request object, and it will get the value with the name. Since this is not available, it will return null. So we can say that the request is generating every time. Okay, so it means the request object doesn't remember, and the server is still not remember that from where the request is coming, because the HTTP is a stateless protocol. It doesn't maintain the connection between your application and your client. Every time when you send a request to the client, it will process and get back response to the client, and after that connection will be destroyed. When you send a new request to the server, then it will create a new request object. Okay, now suppose this is your client, this is your client, and you are sending a request for this servlet. So there are so many servlets, servlet 1, servlet 2. So you can send any number of, you can create any number of servlets in your application. So this is your servlet 3, this is your servlet 4, and so on. This client sends a request for this servlet, and after that, this servlet process your request, the client's request, and a response get back to the client. Now, this connection that is for your client and server will be break. It will not maintain that this client and this server. Again, next time when the client send a request for another resource, okay, and you want that your server should remember that I am the previous client which has already sent a request for any other resource. So you have to maintain the session for this client. So whenever you send a request, you need to send a token to the server that I am the previous client. Just look at this token, and when you show the token to the server, server will remember and identify you that, okay, the same client requesting for another resource, and whatever the resources you have picked up in the previous request and you have put into the session object, it will hand over to the client again, because the server is identifying you are the right user. So how to maintain this? How to maintain this scenario? So this scenario is actually called the session management. Fine. So to do this, there are different ways. So how to manage state with the Java platform? One is your cookies. Cookies means the persistent cookies and the session cookies. There are two types of the cookies. Next one is your Java session API that we can use to maintain the session. Third one is your URL rewriting. And fourth one is your using hidden form field. The most secure and the most useful way to maintain the session, and we use in our application, is the session API. This is the way, this is the most of the time that you will use when you develop any application to maintain the session, to manage the session, and to make the HTTP as stateful. So you can use any one of them, but this way, the cookies and the Java session are the most secure. And actually the session API are the most secure way to maintain the session, to manage the session, and to store the value of any client. So come here. The cookies, no, this is not, I will not discuss this one. First, I'll discuss the session API. Cookies we'll see, but today I'll discuss the session API. Only the theoretical part. This is the conceptual thing that you have to understand. After that, if you understand very well, then you can write the code. Otherwise, this is my experience. If you are not well understand the session, then believe me, every time you will, whenever you will write the code, you will uh, generate the error and you will not get the proper output. So this session API is very important. To understand this, just understand the whole scenario and the concepts. So this is the web application session. State information can also be saved on the server side in server memory. State information, okay? How to relate each visit client with the specific session. So we can do this by server memory storage. Each visit session is identified by the unique ID, and that is called the session ID, which is passed with every request. What are the way to pass the ID to the server? So generally, when you send any request, then it will be go with your request by default. Session duration. On the server side, session duration is set by the server. Session expires when there is no activity for the certain amount of the time. So we can set this value. What is the duration for this to maintain the session? I'm talking about the session API. I'm not talking about the cookies. I'm not talking about the URL rewriting. I'm not talking about the hidden form field. I'm just talking about the session API. So this is your session lifecycle. So how does it work? Just look at here. This is the client browser and it sends the first request. Remember, this is the first request. And when it will go to the server and it requests for any servlet or JSP, it could be for any resource, and that resource could be your servlet or JSP. Remember, the resource must be servlet or JSP to maintain the session lifecycle HTTP session, to get the HTTP session. Now, here on the servlet or JSP, one session object will be created. One session object will be created. And into the session object, you can put data if you want. And when you put the data into the session object, you can save that value into the server memory. And after that, when the session is created, when response is get back to the browser, one ID will be created. The session is created. So this session has a unique ID. And this ID creation is the responsibility of your server. It is not the responsibility of the coder, of the developer. This ID will be created by the server, and this ID will be go back to the browser, session ID. Now session ID is set into the browser. So whenever you send any request after the first request, in your request, session ID is sent to the server. Now, when any request further coming to the server, server will ask, do you have any ID? So the request says, yes, I have ID, and request will show the ID to the server, and server will say, will see that the ID is available on to the memory or not. If that session ID is available, so whatever you have saved into the memory with respect to that ID will be hand over to that session object. And after that, you can process the data, and then you can again send the response to the browser. So the whole thing is, whenever a user or a client send a request to the server first check that the coming request has any ID or not. If not, then it will create a session ID and it will hand over that ID to the browser. So further, whenever a client send a request to this server or any resource, with respect to that ID, whatever you have saved will hand over to the corresponding requested resource. And after that, you can perform your logic. After that, you can perform your action. So session ends after the certain idle period. Session ends after browser is closed. So when your client, that is your browser, is closed, so that session ID will be destroyed on the client side, not onto the server side. Remember this. So when you open your browser one more time and you send a request for the servlet, so it will not send the ID because that session ID has been closed. So you will not able to get that session ID. So maintain that value that after closing the browser, we should get the previous data. We write the cookies. That is called the persistent session maintenance. Okay. Again. So to use this, what we use this HTTP session API. To get, we get the object of the HTTP session, and this represent a session. To get a session object into the servlet, we use the code request.getSession, and to get the session into onto the JSP, you don't need to write this statement. You will get by default that object. Properties of these this session API. One is ID. You can get the ID of that session. What is the creation time? It is the new or the old session. So you can get these properties of the session. What is the use of this session API? Session is automatically created by the web server. Remember this point, you don't need to create it. Server will create for you. Session ID is automatically generated by the web server and it will be unique. Session ID is sent to the client either as session cookies or the URL parameters automatically. Store data in the session. So if you want to store the value into the container, that is your session. So as we are storing the value into the request container, as we are setting the value into the servlet context container, we can set the value into the session container by using set attribute method with the object of the session, that is session.set attribute. And to get the data, simple, we use the method get attribute. And needs typecasting if an object is stored in the session. So we are doing the same thing with the request and servlet context. So we'll do the typecasting. So here is your session application, user login, and how to maintain the value. So I hope this is now clear that what is the session, but how to use, this is the part of the coding. Now tell me, any question related to the session? No. Okay. Okay, so when I'll discuss the JSP, then you will get the answer of your question. And if I tell you right now, then maybe you will not understand very well because we haven't discussed the JSP. Okay. So after the discussion of JSP, then I'll tell you that when we should write and when we should go for the JSP and when we should go for the servlet. Okay, Meng. So definitely I'll explain this thing. I know that this is an important aspect when we develop the application. Okay. So in my experience and in my opinion, and the previous experience says that if anyone knows the servlet and if anyone has hands-on practice on the servlet, then he or she can write the code of the web application through the Java on any framework. So that's why the main emphasis of my session um, is on the servlets, because everything that is maintained by the web container is actually a part of the servlet, direct or indirect. If it is get executed, it maintains the life cycle, then it is the servlet. Actually, the JSP is also a servlet. Okay, JSP actually gets converted into servlet internally. So if you know the things of the servlet, so you know the JSP as well. But you know the JSP and the thing that is not discussed with respect to the servlet, so maybe you will not able to write the code perfectly. So when I'll discuss the JSP, then I'll tell you that when we should go for the JSP and when should we go for the servlets. Okay, Meng? Now tell me, the session is now clear. One more time, I'll explain this one with the example, but tomorrow we'll see the example with the session API. And session is very important, very important. The session API. Rest of the things, that is cookies, is also important. The hidden form field, the URL rewriting, but the most of the time, 99% time, you will write the session API. You will use the session API. So make sure that you have the practice on the session API. So tomorrow I'll discuss that how to use the session API in our application. With whole scenario, I will create and I will write the code in front of you. Just look at that code tomorrow and understand the things. Okay. So that's all for today from my side. If you have any query, any question, then you can put your queries. Otherwise, we'll bind up. Okay, welcome. Welcome, man. Okay, good. So that's all for today. Okay, thank you for joining this session. Bye-bye.